After a year and a half of shooting with my Fuji X-T3, I have finally decided to retire it, and I have upgraded to the Fujifilm X-H2s, which is recording this right now. I got the X-H2s only today, so before diving into it, I wanted to go over the X-T3 and just make a long-term review because this camera is fantastic and I think it deserves a farewell video. Over the year and a half I've owned this X-T3, I've used it for a bunch of different stuff, from photo to video, from real estate, food, weddings, events, basically whatever you can film or take photos of, I did, and it performed damn near perfectly for everything I did with it. Even being a 5-year-old camera, this thing still has a lot to offer, and I would say it still gives comparable results with much newer and much better cameras. If you're a hybrid shooter and want a good camera that shoots great video, great photos, and you don't want it to break the bank, I think the X-T3 is a perfect option. If you can spend a bit more, the X-T4 might be a bit better with having IBIS and dual slot recording for video, but honestly, the X-T3 can basically do 90% of what the X-T4 can for at least 200 or 300 euros less. Right now you can pick up a used X-T3 for about 600 to 800 euros, which is great value for what you get, especially on the video side. The X-T3 shoots great 4K 420 video at 24, 36 and 60 frames per second. Especially having 60 frames per second 4K 10-bit is already a good enough reason for buying this camera. I do have to note that 60 frames per second in this camera does have a slight crop of 1.18, which is not definitely a deal breaker, especially because you can get 24 and 30 frames per second in the same quality without a crop. Also, when it comes to video, this thing gives you great codecs. It can shoot up to 400 megabits per second. Honestly, I always kept it at 200 just because I didn't want too big of files to work with, but yeah, even 200 is more than a lot of other brands offer. If you only shoot photos and don't shoot video, I would advise getting the X-T30, which has the exact same sensor and basically the exact same photography performance as the X-T3 in a bit of a smaller package and for a few hundred euros less. Of course, this thing is 5 years old and of course it's not perfect. Some of the weak points of this camera, in my opinion, would be first the small grip, which it's not a big issue, but on long days you start to feel it, and especially if you have big hands and you're coming from a camera with a deep grip, this kind of feels like there's nothing to hold on to. The second thing would be the battery life. The battery life in this thing, especially for video, really sucks. When you're shooting video, you can get through your battery in about 30 minutes to an hour, which is kind of a pain, and you need to carry at least 4 to 8 batteries with you. What I usually do is have a power bank and my dual battery charger with me, so as soon as I go through one battery, I just stick it on the charger right away, and that way I always have a new battery ready, and usually I bring along with the charger 4 batteries. Another thing I would have loved to have had in this camera is the custom mode dials, but with having the top dials to adjust the settings, obviously there's not really a place to put custom modes, which is a shame, and especially on clients shoots and stuff like that, you want to be able to change settings really quickly, but without the custom mode dials you can't really do that. And the last, let's say, negative I would say about this camera is not having IBIS, which is not a deal breaker, you can get through it. I shot a lot of handheld stuff without IBIS and I managed fine. Having a stabilized lens will help you a lot, at least taking off some of the micro jitters when going handheld. But yeah, generally IBIS would be a good addition, and they have added it to the X-T4, which is why the X-T4 is a better hybrid camera, but this without IBIS is still good and you can still get great footage without it. I want to mention the autofocus in this. It's not a weak point, but it's definitely not a strong point. It does okay, let's say. It's not the best autofocus. It does have IIF, and for talking heads like this works perfectly, but generally I wouldn't trust it too much. I would never use the camera in the multi-autofocus setting because it just doesn't know what to focus on, so I always kept it on area and just moved the box with the joystick. That did the trick, and basically for most stuff the autofocus was good and reliable, but not as good as modern Fuji cameras and definitely not as good as the Canon or Sony autofocus. Now let's get into some of the strong points of this camera, and the first thing I would say is the sensor. The X-Trans 4 sensor is honestly my favorite sensor I've used so far. It's really easy to work with for video and for photos. If you're planning to shoot JPEGs, it's a great option. Having all the Fuji film emulations gives you a lot of variability of what you can get, and also you can customize some settings like highlights, shadows and stuff like that that you can't really do in other cameras. This brings me to the second strong point, which is customization. Along to having the option to customize your film simulation, you can also customize basically any button on the camera to do whatever you want it to do. And this was really important for me because it really helped me have a much quicker and easier workflow with the camera when shooting video. Probably the biggest strong point for the camera is the video specs, because as I said earlier, at this price no other camera offers such good video. And lastly, I would say is the build quality. So this thing is weather sealed, feels really sturdy in the hand, it feels like you could drop it. I have dropped it a bunch of times and never had any issues. One thing that's common with these cameras is that sometimes with third-party batteries you can have some issues with. I had issues where the camera would reset itself to factory settings every once in a while, and after getting rid of some of the older third-party batteries I had, this issue was solved. So I would say if you start getting random issues with the camera, try changing the batteries and this may help you solve your issue. When it comes to the design and the style of the camera, I both like it and don't. I really like how the camera looks. I love using it when I'm doing street photography, when I'm doing stuff just for myself, where I have time, where I don't have to rush to get my settings right. So if I'm just walking around, I really love using the manual dials. I love just the tactile experience this camera gives you. But when it comes to client work, when it comes to paid shoot, especially for weddings and events, I don't like this type of shooting just because it takes me a lot more time to get my settings right than if I'm using, let's say, the X-H2s or basically any normal modern DSLR style camera. Now I want to touch up on my workflow with the camera and how I had it set up for video. For the last 3-4 months I've been shooting classic ROM for video instead of shooting F-Log. Before I used to always shoot everything with F-Log, which is great, but honestly after switching to classic ROM and tweaking it a bit, I was really impressed with how good of an image you can get, how much highlight and shadow retention you can get without shooting log, and how much easier my workflow was with shooting only classic ROM. I stole the idea for shooting classic ROM for video from John Stembaugh, which has a couple great videos about classic ROM and about his settings, and specifically the settings I use, which are I set my highlights to -2, my shadows to -2. This helps giving a more flat image, takes a bit of the contrast out, and probably helps saving the highlights and the shadows in the image. And I lower the sharpness and color to -2 as well. I leave the noise reduction at 0 and I set the dynamic range to 200. This makes your base ISO 320, which is fine. It's not hard to expose with no matter the setting, and I rarely need to go below that, so that's fine. And honestly, I'm really amazed on how much information you can retain while shooting like this, and how much faster and easier my workflow is when editing this footage. As I said before, Fuji lets you customize any button you want on the camera, and the most important two for me were autofocus lock and white balance lock. I would set white balance lock to my AEL button, and I would set it as an on-off switch. This way I can point the camera at my scene and just lock the white balance, so I don't have it change while filming, and also I don't have to go through and set it to the exact Kelvin value I need it at. With the autofocus lock button, I set it so when it's pressed it locks the autofocus, and when I release it the autofocus kicks back on. This way I can lock focus on whatever I need, and if something changes in the scene or if I'm reframing, I can then let it go and it focuses on whatever the next thing is I want to focus on. Or it also helps a lot when you want to introduce some foreground elements into the scene but don't want the autofocus to start getting lost between the foreground and the subject. To close this up, I want to say that the X-T3 definitely still offers great value even 5 years after it was released. For both photography but especially for video, I think for the price this thing is still a great option. With the many firmware updates Fujifilm gave this camera, they really improved it from what it was when it was first released. Sadly, I don't think there's much they can improve anymore, and I don't think they will be releasing new firmware for the X-T3 just because they have a whole new lineup of cameras out, and 5 years later I don't think there's much of a point for the company to keep updating a discontinued camera. Even though I'm retiring mine, I still recommend these cameras to people, and I will keep recommending them as long as there's still decent condition Fujifilm X-T3s and X-T4s on the market.